I'm with the American Transportation Research Institute. We're the not-for-profit research arm of the trucking industry. Um, we have this really wonderful board of directors, a lot of fleets that I'm sure you will recognize on here that supports our work. We also have a research advisory committee, which is made up of individuals from across the trucking industry, not just fleets, but drivers, insurers, legal, suppliers as well. And this group gets together every year and identifies what the top research needs are in the trucking industry. The kinds of things that they're not going to do internally at a single company, but that we really want this industry-wide picture of. And I go into this in part because as a not-for-profit, we really rely and are so grateful for these folks, but also because they are the ones who selected this topic, the diesel technician shortage, as a top research need a couple of years ago. So we produced this report earlier this year. There's been a lot of talk about the shortage of technicians, and what we really wanted to do at ATRI was to try to get a kind of three-pronged approach and to figure out the uh, where the gaps are, where the knowledge gaps or the communication breakdowns exist between our really core three groups here of techs, diesel shops, and then the training programs that train quite a few techs, not all. We'll get to that in a second. We were looking at missed opportunities in recruitment, what skills really need the better training, and then why techs leave the trucking industry for either jobs as techs in other industries or some cases leave the diesel tech world altogether. So I'll sort of organize my slides first of all by introducing the shortage as a topic and why we call it a shortage, and then I'll go into then training, recruitment, and retention, those sort of three big areas there. And I will pause at the end of each of these for questions as well, rather than maybe just shoving off to the end, because I find, especially in the later afternoon, it can be hard to remember what your question was back on slide 4 by the end of the period. So what is the shortage here? Well, almost two-thirds of all shops were understaffed in 2025 based on our survey. So that's a pretty major percentage of shops. Vacancy rate was about 19% and turnover was about 16 and a half. There was also a weak correlation between pay and vacancy. So in other words, it wasn't just that the shops paying the least had the worst shortages. Uh, the shortage generally was being experienced by all shops, even with those pay differences. So I go into those data points because often we'll debate, whether shortage is the technically accurate term for what's being experienced in an employment situation. And in this case, we feel that it is because really what we're looking at here is it's a ongoing, persistent, long-running struggle to get enough qualified techs capable of filling positions. And it can't be explained just by turnover or just by pay alone. Again, that turnover rate, 16 and a half, actually isn't bad. Again, there's more vacancies than there is turnovers. So again, that tells us it's not just a matter of, techs spend 2 months here and it's awful, right? It's not just that the conditions are bad or something like that. Couple more broad picture angles here. This gives us a sense for how the industry experiences the shortage. You've got two lines here tracking the change in employment over the last decade. That lighter salmon pinkish color, the one that ends up on the top, is the change in truck driver employment over the last decade. So as you can see, that's increased by about 30%. And during that same period of time, technician employment has only increased by 23%. So that delta you see at the upper right of about 7 percentage points, that's what we experience as a shortage. And really, again, you can see it begin in about 2019 there and then continue, those two lines continue to diverge. I did say that pay doesn't explain everything, but pay is, of course, an important piece of this equation. And here you can see there's a lot going on, but really what I want you to focus on is that black line is trucking, and that's annual diesel tech pay again over the last 10 years. And each of those other lines is a pure industry that trucking competes with for talent when it comes to diesel techs. So you can see at the top a couple, again, important competitor industries. We've got federal, state, and local government and heavy and civil engineering construction. Those other lines, you've got ag in there, educational services, merchant wholesalers. So for trucking, that's mostly dealers, and then other independent repair and maintenance shops as well. So a big takeaway here is trucking has been increasing that pay pretty significantly, but so is everyone else. It's been such a competitive job market, and especially in those years since the pandemic, you can see those lines all just shooting up, that it's really a fast evolving space, and that poses its own challenge, really. Okay, so I'm going to launch now into our findings on training shortfalls. So training, then recruitment, and then retention. First of all, as a lot of us already know, the majority and pretty healthy majority of first-time techs have no prior training when they enter the industry. They're not going to some kind of technical school or some additional formal training program. Now, maybe they worked part-time in a shop during school. Maybe they had some tech ed classes. That does not count here, but about 62% of techs had no formal training prior to starting the job. And that's a pretty big challenge. It costs about 360 hours, we found, or a little over $8,000 just in trainee wages to get a first-time tech without formal training from 0 to 100 working in the shop. That's a pretty significant investment on the part of our shops. And of course, it also means that when turnover does occur, that's a pretty significant, you're out a fair bit of money and time there. Now, techs that did have prior training were, of course, better off. But what I want to sort of stress here, too, is that even techs with training are still coming in with some pretty significant gaps. More than 30% of those techs with formal training were still unqualified in each of the 20 core skill areas that we analyzed in this research. And again, that costs almost 200 hours and almost $4,000. So even for the techs who come in with training, pretty significant um, uh, knowledge gap there. There's a lot going on this slide. Now I should say I've got a couple slides like this that are very detailed, but I promise we'll take them step by step and work through them. So what we see here is a selection of those 20 core skill areas that I just mentioned. Now, the skill area is listed on the left. We asked training programs, how many hours do you spend in each of these areas during training? And you can see that median number of hours, so the middle number of hours there is that next column. Then what we did is we asked all of the diesel shops in our survey, what percent of your techs without formal training are qualified in each of these areas? And then what percent of your techs with formal training are qualified? And so the difference between those two is that improvement in qualification percentage there. And then finally, on the far right side, and this is our sort of takeaway column, we looked then at, okay, so for every hour on average that a training program spends in this skill area, how much improvement are they getting compared to a tech, again, who's coming into the job with no background training? So There's a couple different groupings here. On the top, you can see with the green color there on the percentages, these are areas where training is currently pretty effective. So each hour is resulting in a lot of improvement. So cab hardware, for example, every hour they spend in that area results in a 33% improvement in qualification. That's good. So these are areas where if we want improvement, just adding an additional hour can go a long way. Now, on the bottom half, on the other hand, are areas where training is currently, ineffective is a little harsh, but under effective, let's say. These are areas where adding an additional hour is going to have diminishing returns. So maybe these are places where we need to excuse me, thinking creatively and maybe how can we reevaluate our training protocols or our training systems? What new approaches might be more useful here?
Hey, Alex, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Says, can you define what you mean by qualified or what makes a tech qualified?
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't have a hard and fast definition for that. That was the question that we asked to shops. So, and again, that's partly because, of course, exact definitions, there's going to be some variation. But what we did point to here, and that would be both for shops and for training programs, was the ASE's recommended um, uh, training curricula, basically. The automotive, gosh, I always get this acronym wrong. Automotive Service Excellence. I think that's correct, has really one of the authoritative outlines here. So we deferred to them and we pointed respondents in that direction. Yeah. Any other questions here on this training slide or on these last, I suppose, two training slides? All right, hearing none, I will jump into our recruitment section now. There are a number of barriers for anyone who wants to become a tech. This is right here results from our survey of technicians. Unsurprisingly, anyone who talks to a tech will know that the cost of tools is the biggest barrier. It's thousands of dollars that a new tech has to, outlay on their own. There are some training programs that help a bit. There are some shops that help a bit, but it's a pretty high expense level that really sets apart an entry position as a technician, really compared to entry level positions in almost any other field. Um, Lack of knowledge or experience was another barrier. Again, thinking about the fact that the majority of techs don't have that formal training. Uh, that's both a straightforward knowledge lack barrier, but you can also see actually that bottom barrier to entry, low confidence, is another actually important one that is very much related. Where again, if a tech doesn't have that knowledge, it's going to also impact how comfortable they feel. That can be a turnover issue. You can see I'm sort of jumping around a little bit, but one more related one to that is right smack in the middle, poor shop training or mentorship. About 11% of technicians mentioned this, and that mentorship line really was an important one. We heard that in several different instances as an area where a lot of techs said that they felt when they first started that it was kind of a, veterans versus the new guys situation, and crossing that chasm was something that was a challenge for them, both in terms of getting the knowledge they needed, but also in terms of a good workplace culture, which will come up in a couple of the next slides as well. We asked tech respondents what their top decision factors were for entering trucking, and we asked them to rank them. So we had this list of 12, which you can see listed on the left-hand side, and then those texts were able to rank them from 1 to 12, and anything that didn't matter for them, they just didn't rank at all. So in that figure, again, it's another busy figure, but you can see that the number, that is the average ranking. So higher pay was the top ranked overall with an average rating of 3.2. Now, you can see those curves, those humps are in there as well to help show how the distribution of responses worked out. And that's really important because um, as you can see, there's some differences of opinion that if you just looked at that average number, you would miss. So pay, of course, is the top factor, but I would point out a couple things here. First of all, if every single tech had said pay was my number one, the average ranking would be one, right? They all said one, it would be one. But you see that the average per pay is actually a little less than three. And what that should tell you is that even though pay is the number one, there are a lot of other factors that techs are ranking as number one or two. So again, pay important, but sometimes I think we can have our blinders on when it comes to how do we bring people into the industry. Oh, let's just go back to pay. That's the simple one. But I always want to get us to look past pay and some of these other factors. So you can see the second one is more convenient shift and desired hours. That was a very common point for techs entering trucking. More interesting work, you can see, is at number three, and that's related to the fifth ranked one, more variety of work. And again, I'll point out too, not only are those highly ranked, but if you look at those curves, you can see that a lot of techs were ranking each of those two things as their number one issue or their number two issue. So again, there's some difference of opinion. That average gets pulled down by some techs, but for others, interest and variety in work is of pivotal importance. And again, you're going to see that on the next couple slides too. I really can't understate how important that is for diesel techs. There were a couple other areas as well before I leave this slide, a little bit farther down where you can see, again, using those curves, you can see kind of a two hump curve situation. So a little bit farther than halfway down, you've got pay incentives for additional certification and availability and reimbursement of additional certification. You can see that techs are kind of being pulled in two different directions there. Some say, yeah, that's pretty important, maybe number three. And then some techs are saying, that's not really a big deal for me. I want to highlight that because this is the area where shop culture really becomes an important factor. For some techs, again, where that incentive and that reimbursement to be able to continue to grow and develop their skills, for some, that's really important. For others, not so much. So this is going to be one of those areas where a shop can try to identify, okay, what is the priority for us? And what are the kinds of techs that we want to attract? And then once they've decided that and figured that out, being able to play to those strengths is what we found here useful. All right, so that's then the section on recruitment. So do we have any questions on the recruitment topic before I move to retention? All right, hearing none.
Actually, I was gonna
Oh,
ask something,
yeah, please.
Alex. So the data that you're using to kind of show these graphs, is that, I mean, that's sort of nationwide data? I mean, would you say in Minnesota specifically, it would be sort of similar, or are you able to break it down into certain areas or regions?
Yeah, unfortunately, we are not able to break this down at the state level. Yeah, just didn't have
Okay.
quite the volume of responses for that,
Okay.
unfortunately. Yeah, yeah. So this is
Okay.
a nationwide.
Gotcha. Cool.
And if you do, of course, think we'll have another moment at the end too, if you have questions, and we can go back to the other slides as well. But I will jump into the third and final retention section now. So we asked techs for their satisfaction rating. Again, in all of those same areas that you saw here, essentially. So pay, variety of work, interesting work. We asked for their satisfaction rating on a scale of 1 to 5. So 5 is I'm fully satisfied. This is great. 1 is completely unsatisfied. And then we broke down the techs into two separate groups. The techs who said, I'm looking for another job, and then the techs who were not looking for another job. And what we did is we compared then those average satisfaction ratings to try to figure out, okay, which aspects of employment have the biggest impact on a tech deciding to look for another job? And so the ones you're looking at right now, just 6, are the statistically significant ones. The ones where those two groups, the job seekers and the job keepers, are statistically different in their satisfaction. So pay, again, shows up right at the top there. A tech who is unsatisfied in his or her pay is going to be more likely to be looking for a alternative job. Whereas the flip side, if a tech is satisfied with their pay, they are more likely to stay at their current job. Interactions with management and then interactions with colleagues, as you can see, are two big ones on here. And that links partly back to what you heard from the techs when they said that mentorship was, or rather the lack of mentorship, was a barrier to entering the industry. Again, here we see those social aspects of life in the shop are important. These are folks that you're working with. Again, variety of work and interesting work also show up here as significant factors. If a tech is uninterested, if they're just doing oil changes day in, day out, don't have variety, they are going to be much more likely to be looking for another job. And then finally, pay incentives for additional certification did also show up here as well. Okay, so that's sort of the side of, okay, what makes them look for a new job? The next question that we asked techs, and again, another complicated slide here, but again, we'll walk through it. We wanted to understand, how do techs understand the trucking industry compared to these other industries that are competing for tech talent? So we narrowed it down to a couple of the biggest ones. Ag, automotive. So those aren't diesel techs, but there is still, crossover between the automotive and the diesel tech space. Buses or other mass transit, and then construction. So from the trucking's perspective here, green means good. So green means that trucking was more favorable for techs on average. So more techs were saying trucking is better, net parity there. And then red is bad from the trucking perspective. You, of course, would just sort of flip that the other way if you were coming at it from, say, the perspective of someone working in the construction industry. So, in other words, we can walk that through and say, so techs said that they felt that techs in trucking, that is, said that they thought that trucking had better pay than the automotive industry did for techs. And they also felt that trucking had an edge up when it came to pay versus buses and other mass transit. So again, we can read it by sort of the rows here, or we can read it by column, which I find really useful to take that column approach. And again, to really get that industry to industry comparison. So, for example, if you go to the far right and look at construction, techs generally said that construction had better variety of work and more interesting work. And that's not terribly surprising, right? The variety of different equipment types you see in the heavy duty construction space is going to be greater than what you see in trucking. So that is a downside for trucking. But on the plus side for trucking, you can see that techs generally perceived trucking as having safer shop conditions, cleaner or more comfortable shop conditions, and also better hours in terms of convenience of shift. So again, you can look at this and compare it to other industries and think about, again, trucking versus construction. There's always going to be some pluses and some minuses. And so the big takeaway that I emphasize here is that, again, it's a matter of recognizing industry strengths. How does this differ? And ideally, in any given industry, you want to attract the techs that are going to actually stick around, right? You want to get the right ones in the door from the start. Again, reducing all that turnover, which is expensive for everyone. And a bit of a delay for techs too, who again want to get their career moving. So this approach of trying to sort of better play to the strengths of each industry and to better be more transparent, better publicize those relative strengths is, we think, one useful path to addressing, again, not necessarily a lack of text, but addressing the fact that we have the turnover across industries and we have, again, um, that extra cost that goes along with turnover. One final slide here on retention, and that is focused on underutilized, or well, rather, it's really about retention strategies, but a couple of them are underutilized. So if you look at the top, again, increasing pay shows up at the very top for trying to bring, or rather trying to keep more folks in the industry. Expanded benefits comes second. And then third is more vacation, sick days, or leave. Now, in the full report, what we also found, though, is that some of these strategies are used much more than others. So almost all shops are trying to increase pay and benefits. Um, but some of these areas are relatively underutilized. So more vacation, for example, actually is only used by about half of all shops right now. And that does play into something that we see from a lot of millennials and Gen Zs right now, which is an interest in work-life balance. And so, again, there's a bit of a cost in terms of workflow, but it's not the same as handing out additional pay. A couple other areas here, we're moving more techs from third shift to first or second. That was an area that it was very highly ranked among the fleets who had, or among the shops rather, who had really leaned in and really committed to it. Other fleets, who maybe just dabbled in it or hadn't tried it, didn't have a positive opinion of it yet. Another one was expanding or cycling responsibilities, which again, you can see that's nearly at the bottom actually of the figure on the left there, but you can see it's another one of those two hump distribution curves where, again, some shops felt very strongly that expanding or cycling responsibilities was a valuable way to keep more techs in the in the you know in the trade. And then again, a lot of shops hadn't tried it or maybe hadn't really given it a full trial yet. And of course, that's one area that does correspond once again to that really preeminent importance attached by techs to the interest of their work and the variety of their work. I always show this slide because as a not-for-profit, again, we rely on the support of uh, of everyone, whether that's financial or when it comes to supporting with data collection. This kind of data is only available, of course, because folks fill out our surveys. So um, before I forget it, I will just say we encourage you to visit our website and sign up for our emails. I promise that we are not annoying about overstimulating on the email front, but that way you will see our new research when it comes out and also our calls to participate in data collection as well. And with that said, now I will actually pause for any questions either about that final retention section or anything else that we've covered. I've got the power to scroll back to those complicated slides. So